4,000 years ago, in the floodplain of the Indus River, across what is now Pakistan and northwest India, a civilization that left almost no written records built a network of cities, sanitation systems, and trading hubs that rivaled anything else in the ancient world. The Indus Valley civilization rose, flourished for over 1,000 years, and then collapsed for reasons archaeologists still argue about today. Most of what these people built has been lost to time, but among the few things that survived are the clay pots they relied on to refrigerate and preserve their food. The earliest documented use traces back to the Indus Valley civilization itself, which flourished between roughly 2,600 and 1,900 years before the Common Era in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. Excavations at Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and Lothal have turned up terracotta storage vessels built with a characteristic double wall and an absorptive surface that lines up exactly with evaporative cooling. These people leaned on the vessels to store grain, water, and fermented dairy products through the brutal summers of the subcontinent. Egyptian artisans recorded the same technology in tomb frescoes painted around 2,500 years before the Common Era. Wall paintings from the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom periods show servants fanning porous clay water jars to speed up the evaporation, and while that variant mostly cooled drinking water for the royal household, the archaeological evidence makes clear the method was widely available to ordinary families as well. The Arabic word for the inner vessel, zeer, traces back through Coptic and ultimately to this Egyptian tradition. Persian engineers folded clay pot cooling into the larger passive cooling architecture I covered in the Windcatcher video. By roughly 400 years before the Common Era, they were running qanats to deliver cool underground water to the base of their Yakjal ice houses. And inside those structures, smaller clay vessels held perishable food at temperatures cold enough to keep meat and dairy edible for weeks at a time. That Persian word for the inner vessel grew from the same root that later produced the Arabic zeer. The Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest built their own variations from local clay somewhere between 1,300 and 1,800 years ago. Those ollas, the spherical or oval clay storage vessels that Pueblo potters still produce today, run on the exact same evaporative cooling principle. Excavations at Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon have pulled up intact ollas carrying surface, mineralization patterns that match long-term evaporative use. Mesoamerican civilizations landed on similar designs drawn from their own local clay. Sources: the Spanish colonial bodajo, which spread across Mexico and the American Southwest between the 16th and 19th centuries, descends directly from pre-Columbian Mesoamerican water-cooling vessels carrying a few European modifications. Rural Mexican households kept bodajos in active use straight through the 20th century, and traditional potters in several Mexican states still produce them today. The Indian subcontinent never let the technology slip away at all. Hundreds of thousands of village potters across India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh still produce the two traditional variants, the matka and the sarahi. A matka is the wide-bellied clay water pot meant for general household water storage, while the sarahi is a narrower necked version used for serving drinking water at meals. Both are evaporative cooling vessels, and both deliver water at temperatures between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, even through the hottest Indian summers. Sahel villagers in West Africa have leaned on essentially the same design for at least 1,000 years. Communities across what is now Nigeria, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Chad have stored grain, vegetables, and water inside unglazed clay vessels packed with damp sand insulation for as long as anyone in the region can document. So thoroughly was the technology baked into local agricultural practice that nobody bothered to study it, formally, until the late 1990s. 7 separate civilizations across 4 continents, with no significant direct contact between them, for most of the relevant centuries, all arrived at the same engineering conclusion. The idea was simple: an unglazed clay pot paired with damp sand or charcoal insulation will cool its interior chamber somewhere between 20 and 30 degrees Fahrenheit below the surrounding air temperature. using nothing but water and ordinary airflow. The physics never cared which civilization figured it out first, because the physics simply works. Let me explain why it works. Because the chemistry here is the part that should make every American homeowner question why their kitchen costs as much as it does. Unglazed terracotta is a porous ceramic made from clay fired at temperatures between 1600 and 2200 degrees Fahrenheit. That firing drives off the water once chemically bonded to the clay and leaves behind a structure of interlocking mineral grains. Separated by microscopic pores, those pores strike a careful balance, wide enough to let liquid water diffuse slowly through the body of the pot, yet narrow enough that the pot holds its water for hours before any significant amount escapes through the outer surface. Once you pack the space between the inner and outer pot with damp sand, water from that sand diffuses slowly through the inner wall of the outer pot, travels through the body of the clay, and emerges on the outer surface, where it evaporates into the surrounding air. Evaporation is a phase change, and turning liquid water into vapor demands energy that has to come from somewhere. In a clay pot system, that energy gets drawn from the heat inside the inner pot, pulled out through the chamber walls and into the evaporation reaction happening at the outer surface. The number that matters here is roughly 540 calories, the amount of energy it takes to evaporate a single gram of water, and that figure is simply the latent heat of vaporization for water at room temperature. It does not shift based on which civilization happens to be doing the evaporating. For every gram of water that converts from liquid to vapor, 540 calories of heat get pulled out of the surroundings. A properly assembled zeer pot can evaporate between 50 and 100 grams of water a day from a single square foot of outer surface, which works out to somewhere between 27,000 and 54,000 calories of heat removal per square foot per day. For comparison, a modern American refrigerator running at an average duty cycle pulls roughly 300,000 calories of heat per day out of its interior, and it burns about 100 watts of continuous electrical power to do it. The clay pot manages something like 1/5 to 1/10 of that cooling work with zero electrical input. That gap in cooling capacity is exactly why the refrigerator can freeze ice cream, while the clay pot can only refrigerate vegetables and dairy. Ice cream, though, is not the bar most of the world is trying to clear. What most of the world actually needs is a way to keep tomatoes from rotting over the next week, and the clay pot clears that bar without any electricity bill at all. Now here is the part of the story that should stop you cold. In 1995, a Nigerian secondary school teacher and pottery enthusiast named Mohammed Ba'aba came home to Jigawa State in the northeast of the country after several years spent studying business administration. Jigawa ranks among the poorer states in Nigeria, where summer temperatures routinely climb past 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and rural communities have almost no access to electricity for refrigeration. Local farmers were watching roughly 70% of their tomato, pepper, and leafy vegetable harvests rot within 2 to 3 days of picking, simply because nothing existed to keep the produce fresh long enough to reach a market. His family had worked as potters for several generations, so the traditional clay pot cooling technology was no mystery to him. What he also understood was that the design had drifted over the years, and that most local potters were no longer producing the configuration that gave the best evaporative cooling. Across 2 patient years, he tested one variable after another: different pot geometries, different clay compositions, different insulating materials packed between the 2 vessels, and different lid arrangements. By 1997, he had locked in a final design, and he distributed it to farmers across Jigawa State at a heavily subsidized cost of roughly 20 cents per unit. Independent agricultural researchers at several Nigerian universities put the design through measurement. Tomatoes that once lasted 2 to 3 days were suddenly holding for 3 to 4 weeks. Bell peppers stretched from a 4-day shelf life out to 2.5 weeks, and spinach and other leafy greens jumped from a single day to roughly 12. Across the participating villages, researchers pegged the total economic impact at several $1,000,000 a year in reduced food waste and improved access to market. His work eventually caught the attention of researchers at the MIT D-Lab, the Applied Design and Engineering program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, built around technology for resource-constrained communities. Their engineers spent the next several years measuring the thermodynamic performance of the Ba'aba design under controlled laboratory conditions. The MIT measurements confirmed that an optimized zeer pot could hold an interior temperature near 50 degrees Fahrenheit while the outside air sat at 100, delivering a steady 50-degree differential produced by nothing more than water evaporating through an unglazed clay surface. In the year 2000, Ba'aba received the Rolex Award for Enterprise, which came with a cash prize of $100,000. He poured that money straight into scaling the program, reaching more than 12,000 families across northern Nigeria by 2005. National Geographic and the New York Times covered the work, and it landed at the United Nations Climate Change Conference in 2007. Now here is the detail that almost nobody outside the development engineering community has ever heard. The MIT D-Lab measurements also captured something those original ancient civilizations seem to have grasped in practice, but never wrote down anywhere. The cooling effect turns out to be only half the story, because the clay pot system also produces an antimicrobial effect that outperforms what a comparable modern refrigerator achieves at the very same temperature. The mechanism starts with the constant evaporation of water from the outer surface of the inner pot. As that water travels through the body of the clay, it carries dissolved minerals along with it. And over time, those minerals settle into the porous structure and create a slightly alkaline microenvironment that suppresses the growth of most common food spoilage bacteria. The clay itself, especially when fired at the correct temperature, has been documented to release tiny amounts of silver and copper ions into the stored food, the very same antimicrobial mechanism the Navy relies on in submarine plumbing through the oligodynamic effect I covered in the prior video. Put the cooling and the antimicrobial action together, and food stored in a properly built clay pot system actually spoils more slowly than the same food held at the same temperature inside a modern refrigerator. The exact size of that advantage shifts depending on the food, but for high water content vegetables and fruits, the difference shows up clearly in laboratory testing. 4,000 years of empirical refinement and independent development across 7 civilizations had produced antimicrobial benefits the original users almost certainly never understood at the molecular level, yet observed clearly enough to select for across generations of practical experience. MIT instrumentation confirmed all of it in the early 2000s. Every bit of it runs on nothing but water and clay. Set all of that against what the average American household currently pays just to keep tomatoes from rotting. A standard American refrigerator runs somewhere between $800 and $2,500 to buy, depending on its size, features, and brand. Over a year, the unit consumes between 150 and 400 kilowatt hours of electricity, and at the current average residential rate of roughly 17 cents per kilowatt hour across the United States, the electricity for refrigeration alone costs each household between $25 and $70 a year. On average, the refrigerator gives out after roughly 13 years of service. The compressor is almost always the part that fails first, and repairing a dead compressor typically costs more than simply replacing the entire unit. Once the old refrigerator gets hauled away, the chemical refrigerant inside has to be professionally extracted, since it counts as a regulated substance under the Environmental Protection Agency's Significant New Alternatives policy, and the disposal fee at most American municipalities lands between $50 and $150. Add up purchase, operating electricity, the occasional repair, and final disposal, and the total household life cycle cost of one modern refrigerator across a typical 13-year run comes to somewhere between $2,500 and $4,500. A properly assembled clay pot system costs between $10 and $25 in materials, and the pots themselves last indefinitely as long as nobody drops them. There is no electricity bill, no compressor waiting to fail, and no refrigerant to dispose of at the end. Across that same 13 years, the total household life cycle cost works out to roughly $20 in initial materials, plus about $15 a year for replacement sand, assuming you use sand for the insulating layer, which adds up to around $215 over 13 years. That leaves a gap of roughly $2,000 to $4,000 per household across a typical 13-year refrigeration cycle. Multiply that figure across the roughly 130 million American households, and the aggregate national cost difference climbs into the hundreds of billions of dollars. The clay pot system does come with real limitations. It cannot freeze food. It cannot hold anything below about 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and it falls flat in humid climates where the evaporation rate runs too slow to produce meaningful cooling. Its storage life for high water content foods is solid, though not quite as long as a modern refrigerator can deliver. For about 2/3 of the foods most American households actually keep on hand, however, the clay pot offers comparable preservation at less than 10% of the lifetime cost. The reason most American households are not using clay pot refrigeration for at least part of their food storage has specific names and dates. Attached to it, in 1806, a Boston businessman named Frederick Tudor started shipping ice cut from frozen New England lakes down to the southern United States and the Caribbean for commercial sale. His ice company grew until it dominated the global ice trade through the second half of the 1800s, and Tudor, along with his competitors, poured money into marketing ice as a necessary commodity for any modern American kitchen. The clay pot alternative needed no purchased ice and no recurring delivery service at all, which is exactly why Tudor Company marketing literature actively painted it as backward and primitive. In 1902, Willis Carrier invented the modern mechanical refrigeration cycle while sorting out a humidity problem at a Brooklyn printing plant. By the 1920s, the Carrier Corporation and other early refrigeration manufacturers were running national campaigns that framed mechanical refrigeration as the symbol of American modernity. By the 1930s, residential refrigerators had become an outright status symbol in middle-class American households, while clay pot storage got filed away as a method fit only for impoverished rural regions. By 1950, the American refrigerator industry had effectively wiped the clay pot tradition out of mainstream consumer awareness. Since then, the industry has consolidated into a handful of major manufacturers, every one of them leaning on the same recurring revenue model, selling fresh refrigerators every 13 years to replace the units that fail. Each clay pot system installed in an American kitchen represents a refrigerator that never got sold and a service contract that never got billed. The development engineering community has kept studying and refining the clay pot design through MIT D-Lab and similar programs at Stanford, the University of California, Berkeley, and several European technical universities. Their research has been published continuously in peer-reviewed engineering journals since the late 1990s, and the information sits out in the open for anyone to read. Almost no American consumer has ever run into a word of it through mainstream media coverage. Here is how you build a working clay pot refrigeration system using materials you can grab at any American garden center for somewhere between $15 and $25 total. Start with 2 unglazed terracotta pots. The outer pot should measure roughly 12 to 14 inches across at the top, which happens to be the standard size for a medium garden planter at most American hardware and garden centers. Your inner pot should run about 8 to 10 inches across at the top, sized so that a 1.5 to 2 inch gap surrounds it on every side once. It sits centered inside the outer pot. Both pots need a plain terracotta finish, with no decorative paint or glazing on either the inner or the outer surfaces. If either pot has drainage holes in the bottom, seal them up with food-safe silicone caulk or with cork stoppers, and let the silicone cure completely before you assemble anything, which takes roughly 24 hours. Pour about 2 inches of clean, dry sand into the bottom of the outer pot to form a base layer. Then set the inner pot down on top of it, centered. Fill the entire gap between the two pots with more clean, dry sand, and saturate that sand thoroughly with cool water until moisture just barely begins to seep through the outer surface. At that point, your system is charged and ready. Lay a clean cotton or linen cloth over the open mouth of the inner pot. Since that cover blocks direct evaporation from the food inside, which would otherwise dry everything out. Soak the cloth thoroughly with the same cool water. Set the finished system in a shaded outdoor spot with good air circulation, somewhere like a covered porch, a shaded corner of the yard, or a screened patio. Keep it out of direct sunlight, because the heat pouring in from the sun simply overwhelms the heat that evaporation can pull back out. Top up the sand with water once a day through the hottest stretch of the year, and every 2 to 3 drays when the weather cools down. Swap the cloth out about once a week to head off any microbial buildup. All told, the daily maintenance comes to about 2 minutes. On a 100-degree Fahrenheit summer afternoon, expect an interior temperature somewhere around 50 to 55 degrees, cool enough to stretch the storage life of most vegetables, fruits, and high water content foods by 4 to 15 times over room temperature. Storage. The system performs best in dry climates where relative humidity stays below about 60%. Once the air turns humid, that cooling effect slips to roughly 15 to 20 degrees below the surrounding temperature. Mohammed Ba'aba died in 2010 at the age of 46 from prostate cancer. He spent the final decade of his life pushing his distribution program out to more than 40,000 families across Nigeria, Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and northern Cameroon. By the time he was gone, the clay pot design he had optimized back in the late 1990s had been documented in MIT engineering journals, presented at the United Nations, and featured in National Geographic. And yet the technology still had not crossed back into mainstream American household use. His daughter, along with several of his former students, carries the work forward today through a nonprofit organization based in Jigawa State. The design he refined still moves across the Sahel region of West Africa today. That very same design would work just as well in Arizona, in Texas, in Mexico, in any dry American climate where the technology can reach its full cooling potential. The chemistry of water evaporating through porous terracotta has not changed in 4,000 years. The Indus Valley potters who first developed the system, the Egyptian craftsmen who painted it onto tomb walls, the Persian engineers who built it into their yakhchals, the Pueblo potters who carried it forward across the American Southwest, the Indian and Pakistani potters who never let it go, the West African villagers still using it today, and Mohammed Ba'aba, who optimized it for modern measurement and conformation, are every one of them working with the very same physics. Water evaporates, heat moves, and food stays cool. If you took something away from this video, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next ones when we post them. That next video digs into the specific compound Roman engineers used to seal the seams between the stone slabs of the cryptoporticus passages, mentioned in the Windcatcher video. Chemistry researchers at the University of Bologna have confirmed that this compound outperforms every modern mortar formulation in long-term durability testing. The Roman version costs roughly $4 per square foot to recreate, while the modern American equivalent runs between $30 and $50 per square foot and lasts about a quarter as long. I will see you in that one.